A Brief History of the United States by John Bach McMaster. Travel Collection 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chad Horner from Ballyclare in County Antrim, Northern Ireland, situated in the northeast of the island of Ireland. A Brief History of the United States by John Bach McMaster. Chapter 1. The New World Found. The New World, of which our country is the most important part, was discovered by Christopher Columbus in 1492. When that great man set sail from Spain on his voyage of discovery, he was seeking not only unknown lands, but a new way to Eastern Asia. Such a new way was badly needed. The routes of trade. Long before Columbus was born, the people of Europe had been trading with the Far East. Spices, drugs, and precious stones, silks and other articles of luxury were brought, partly by vessels and partly by camels, from India, the Spice Islands, the Cathay, China, by various routes, to Constantinople and the cities in Egypt, and along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, where they were traded for the copper, tin, and lead, coral, and woolens of Europe, and then carried to Venice and Genoa, whence merchants spread them over all Europe. The merchants of Genoa traded chiefly with Constantinople, and those of Venice with Egypt. The Turks seized the routes of trade. While this trade was at its height, Asia Minor, from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, was conquered by the Turks. The caravan routes across that country were seized, and when Constantinople was captured in 1453, the trade of Genoa was ruined. Should the Turkish conquests be extended southward to Egypt, as later they were, the prosperity of Venice would likewise be destroyed, and all existing trade routes to the Orient would be in Turkish hands. The Portuguese seek a new route. Clearly an ocean route to the east was needed, and on the discovery of such a route, the Portuguese had long been hard at work. Fired by a desire to expand Portugal and add to the geographical knowledge of his day, Prince Henry, the navigator, sent out explorer after explorer, who, pushing down the coast of Africa, had almost reached the equator before Prince Henry died. His successors continued the good work. The equator was crossed, and in 1487 Dias passed the Cape of Good Hope and sailed eastward till his sailors mutinied. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama sailed around the end of Africa, up the east coast, and on to India, and brought home a cargo of Eastern products. A way to India by water was at last made known to Europe. Columbus planned a route. Meanwhile Christopher Columbus planned what he thought would be a shorter ocean route to the east. He had studied all that was known of geography in his time. He had carefully noted the results of recent voyages of exploration. He had read the travels of Marco Polo, and had learned that off the coast of China was a rich and wonderful island which Polo called Cipango. He believed that the earth is a sphere, and that China and Cipango could be reached by sailing about 2,500 miles due westward across the Atlantic. Columbus seeks aid. To make others think so was a hard task, for nearly everybody believed the earth to be flat, and several foreigners were appealed to before one was found bold enough to help him. He first applied to the King of Portugal, and when that failed, to the King and Queen of Spain. When they seemed deaf to his appeal, he sent his brother to England, and at last, wearied with waiting, set off for France. Then Queen Isabella of Spain was persuaded to act. Columbus was recalled. Ships were provided with which to make the voyage, and on Friday, the 3rd of August, 1492, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina set sails from Palos on one of the greatest voyages ever made by men, the voyage westward. The little fleet went first to the Canary Islands, and thence due west across the Sea of Darkness, as the Atlantic was called. The voyage was delightful, but every sight and sound was a source of new terror to the sailors. An eruption of a volcano at the Canaries was watched with dread as an omen of evil. They crossed the line of no magnetic variation, and when the needle of the compass began to change its usual direction, they were sure it was bewitched. They entered the great Sargasso Sea, and were frightened out of their wits by the strange expanse of floating vegetation. They entered the zone of the trade winds, and as the breeze, day after day, steadily wafted them westward, the boldest feared it would be impossible to return. When a mirage and flights of strange birds raised hopes that were not promptly realized, the sailors were sure they had entered an enchanted realm. Land discovered. Columbus, who was above such fear, explained the unusual sights, calmed the fears of the sailors, hid from them the true distance sailed, and steadily pursued his way till unmistakable signs of land were seen. A staff carved by hand and a branch with berries on it floated by. Excitement now rose high, and a reward was promised to the man who first saw land. At last, on the night of October 11, Columbus beheld a light moving as if carried by hand along a shore. A few hours later a sailor on the Pinta saw land distinctly, and soon all beheld a few miles away a long low beach. The voyage among the islands. Columbus thought he had found one of the islands of the Indies, as the southern and eastern parts of Asia were called. Dressed in scarlet and gold, and followed by a band of his men bearing banners, he landed, fell on his knees, and having given thanks to God, took possession for Spain and called the island San Salvador, which means Holy Saviour. The day was October 12, 1492, and the island was one of the Bahamas. After giving red caps, beads, and trinkets to the natives who crowded about them, Columbus set sail to explore the group, and presently came in sight of the coast of Cuba, which he at first thought was Chipango. Sailing eastward, landing now and then to seek for gold, he reached the eastern end of Cuba, and soon beheld the island of Haiti. This so reminded him of Spain that he called it Hispaniola, or Little Spain, the first Spanish colony in the New World. When off the Cuban shore, the Pinta deserted Columbus. On the coast of Haiti, the Santa Maria was wrecked. To carry all his men back to Spain in the Little Nina was impossible. Such, therefore, as were willing were left at Haiti, and founded La Navidad, the first colony of Europeans in the New World. This done, Columbus sailed for home, taking with him 10 natives and specimens of the products of the lands he had discovered. The voyage home. The Pinta was overtaken off the Haitian coast, but a dreadful storm parted the ships once more, and neither again saw the other till the day when, but a few hours apart, they dropped anchor in the haven of Palos, whence they had sailed 7 months before. As the news spread, the people went wild with joy. The journey of Columbus to Barcelona was a triumphal procession. At Barcelona he was received with great ceremony by the king and queen, and soon afterward was sent back with many ships and men to found a colony and make further explorations in the Indies. Other voyages of Columbus. In all, Columbus made 4 voyages to the New World. On the 2nd, 1493, he discovered Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and other islands. On the 3rd, 1498, he saw the mainland of South America at the mouth of the Orinoco River. On the 4th, 1502 to 1504, he sailed along the shores of Central America. Returning to Spain, he died poor, neglected, and broken-hearted in 1506. Columbus believed he reached the Indies. To his dying day, Columbus was ignorant of the fact that he had led the way to a new continent. He supposed he had reached the Indies. The lands he discovered were therefore spoken of as the Indies, and their inhabitants were called Indians, a name given in time to the copper-coloured natives of both North and South America. Spain's claim to new found lands. One of the first results of the discoveries of Columbus was an appeal to the Pope for a bull securing to Spain the heathen lands discovered. For a bull had secured to Portugal the discoveries of her mariners along the coast of Africa. Pope Alexander VI accordingly drew a north and south line 100 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands, and gave to Spain all she might discover to the west of it, reserving to Portugal all she might discover to the east. A year later, 1494, Spain and Portugal by treaty moved the line of demarcation to 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Map, page 20. And on this agreement, approved by the Pope, Spain rested her claim to America. End of chapter 1 by John Bach McMaster. This recording is in the public domain.
This is an excerpt from The Life of Harriet Beecher Stowe, Chapter 13, called Old Scenes Revisited, 1856. Travel Collection 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in July 2019. Old Scenes Revisited, 1856. After leaving Paris, Mrs. Stowe and her sister, Mrs. Perkins, traveled leisurely through the south of France toward Italy, stopping at Amiens, Lyon, and Marseille. At this place they took the steamer for Genoa, Leghorn, and Civita Vecchia. During their last night on shipboard, they met with an accident, of which and their subsequent trials in reaching Rome, Mrs. Stowe writes as follows. About 11 o'clock, as I had just tranquilly laid down in my berth, I was roused by a grating crash, accompanied by a shock that shook the whole ship, and followed by the sound of a general rush on deck, trampling, scuffling, and cries. I rushed to the door and saw all the gentlemen hurrying on their clothes and getting confusedly toward the stairway. I went back to Mary, and we put our things on in silence, and as soon as we could got into the upper salon. It was an hour before we could learn anything, certainly, except that we had run into another vessel. The fate of the Arctic came to us both, but we did not mention it to each other. Indeed, a quieter, more silent company you would not often see. Had I had any confidence in the administration of the boat, it would have been better, but as I had not, I sat in momentary uncertainty. Had we then known, as we have since, the fate of a boat recently sunk in the Mediterranean by a similar carelessness, it would have increased our fears. By a singular chance, an officer whose wife and children were lost on board that boat was on board ours, and happened to be on the forward part of the boat when the accident occurred. The captain and mate were both below. There was nobody looking out, and had not this officer himself called out to stop the boat, we should have struck her with such a force as to have sunk us. As it was, we turned aside, and the shock came on a paddle-wheel, which was broken by it, for when, after 2 hours' delay, we tried to start and had gone a little way, there was another crash, and the paddle-wheel fell down. You may be sure we did a little sleeping that night. It was an inexpressible desolation to think that we might never again see those we loved. No one knows how much one thinks, and how rapidly, in such hours. In the Naples boat that was sunk a short time ago, the women perished in a dreadful way. The shock threw the chimney directly across the egress from below, so that they could not get on deck, and they were all drowned in the cabin. We went limping along with one broken limb till the next day about 11, when we reached Civita Vecchia, where there were 2 hours more of delay about passports. Then we, that is, Mary and I, and Dr. Edison from Philadelphia, with his son Alfred, took a carriage to Rome, but they gave us a miserable thing that looked as if it had been made soon after the deluge. About 8 o'clock at night, on a lonely stretch of road, the wheel came off. We got out, and our postilions stood silently regarding matters. None of us could speak Italian. They could not speak French, but the driver at last conveyed the idea that for 5 francs he could get a man to come and mend the wheel. The 5 francs were promised, and he untackled a horse and rode off. Mary and I walked up and down the dark, desolate road, occasionally reminding each other that we were on classic ground, and laughing at the oddity of our lonely starlight promenade. After a while our driver came back, Tag, Rag, and Bobtail at his heels. I don't think I can do greater justice to Italian costumes than by this respectable form of words. Then there was another consultation. They put a bit of rotten timber under to pry the carriage up. Fortunately it did not break, as we all expected it would, till after the wheel was on. Then a new train of thought was suggested. How was it to be kept on? Evidently they had not thought far in that direction, for they had brought neither hammer nor nail nor tool of any kind, and therefore they looked first at the wheel, then at each other, and then at us. The doctor now produced a little gimlet, with the help of which the broken fragments of the former linchpin were pushed out, and the way was cleared for a new one. Then they began knocking a fence to pieces to get out nails, but none could be found to fit. At last another ambassador was sent back for nails. While we were thus waiting, the diligence in which many of our ship's company were jogging on to Rome came up. They had plenty of room inside, and one of the party, seeing our distress, tried hard to make the driver stop, but he doggedly persisted in going on, and declared if anybody got down to help us, he would leave him behind. An interesting little episode here occurred. It was raining, and Mary and I proposed, as the wheel was now on, to take our seats. We had no sooner done so than the horses were taken with a sudden fit of animation, and ran off with us in the most vivacious manner. Tag, Rag, and Company shouted in the rear. Some heaps of stone a little in advance presented an interesting prospect by way of a terminus. However, the horses were lucidly captured before the wheel was off again, and our ambassador being now returned, we were set right and again proceeded. I must not forget to remark that at every post where we changed horses and drivers, we had a pitched battle with the driver for more money than we had been told was the regular rate, and the carriage was surrounded with a perfect mob of ragged, shock-headed, black-eyed people whose words all ended in "ino," and who raved and ranted at us till finally we paid much more than we ought to get rid of them. At the gates of Rome, the official, after looking at our passports, coolly told the doctor that if he had a mind to pay him 5 francs, he could go in without further disturbance, but if not, he would keep the baggage till morning. This form of statement had the recommendation of such precision and neatness of expression that we paid him forthwith, and into Rome we dashed at 2 o'clock in the morning of the 9th of February, 1857, in a drizzling rain. We drove to the Hotel d'Angleterre. It was full, and ditto to 4 or 5 others, and in the last effort our refractory wheel came off again, and we all got out into the street. About a dozen lean, ragged corbies, who are called porters, and who are always lying in wait for travelers, pounced upon us. They took down our baggage in a twinkling, and put it all into the street, and surrounded it, and chattered over it, while Em and I stood in the rain and received first lessons in Italian. How we did try to say something, but they couldn't talk anything but in "ino," as aforesaid. The doctor finally found a man who could speak a word or two of French, and leaving Mary, Alfred, and me to keep watch over our pile of trunks, he went off with him to apply for lodgings. I have heard many flowery accounts of first impressions of Rome. I must say ours were somewhat somber. A young man came by and addressed us in English. How cheering! We almost flew upon him. We begged him at least to lend us his Italian to call another carriage, and he did so. A carriage which was passing was luckily secured, and Mary and I, with all our store of boxes and little parcels, were placed in it, out of the rain at least. Here we sat while the doctor from time to time returned from his wanderings to tell us he could find no place. "Can it be," said I, "that we are to be obliged to spend a night in the streets?" What made it seem more odd was the knowledge that, could we only find them, we had friends enough in Rome who would be glad to entertain us. We began to speculate on lodgings. Who knows what we may get entrapped into? Alfred suggested stories he had read of beds placed on trap-doors, of teasters which screwed down on people and smothered them, and so, when at last the doctor announced lodgings found, we followed in rather an uncertain frame of mind. We alighted at a dirty stone passage, smelling of cats and onions, damp, cold, and earthy. We went up stone stairways, and at last were ushered into 2 very decent chambers where we might lay our heads. The corbies all followed us, black-haired, black-browed, ragged, and clamorous as ever. They insisted that we should pay the pretty little sum of 20 francs, or $4, for bringing our trunks about 20 steps. The doctor modestly but firmly declined to be thus imposed upon, and then ensued a general chatteration. One and all fell into attitudes, and inos and isimos rolled freely. "For pity's sake, get them off," we said. So we made a truce for 10 francs, but still they clamored, forced their way even into our bedroom, and were only repulsed by a loud and combined volley of "no, no, no's," which we all set up at once, upon which they retreated. Our hostess was a little French woman, and that reassured us. I examined the room, and seeing no trace of treacherous teasters or trap-doors, resolved to avail myself, without fear of the invitation, of a very clean white bed, where I slept till morning without dreaming. The next day we sent our cards to Monsieur Bartholomew, and before we had finished breakfast he was on the spot. We then learned that he had been watching the diligence office for over a week, and that he had the pleasant set of apartments we are now occupying all ready and waiting for us. March the 1st. My dear husband, every day is opening to me a new world of wonders here in Italy. I have been to the catacombs, where I was shown many memorials of the primitive Christians, and today we are going to the Vatican. The weather is sunny and beautiful beyond measure, and flowers are springing in the fields on every side. Oh, my dear, how I do long to have you here, to enjoy what you are so much better fitted to appreciate than I. This wonderful combination of the past and the present, of what has been and what is. Think of strolling leisurely through the Forum, of seeing the very stones that were laid in the time of the Republic, of rambling over the ruined palace of the Caesars, of walking under the Arch of Titus, of seeing the dying gladiator, and whole ranges of rooms filled with wonders of art, all in one morning. All this I did on Saturday, and only wanted you. You know so much more, and could appreciate so much better. At the palace of the Caesars, where the very dust is a mélange of exquisite marbles, I saw for the first time an acanthus growing, and picked my first leaf. Our little ménage moves on prosperously. The doctor takes excellent care of us, and we of him. One sees everybody here at Rome, John Bright, Mrs. Hemans' son, Mrs. Gaskell, etc., etc. Over 5,000 English travelers are said to be here. Jacob Abbott and his wife are coming. Rome is a world. Rome is an astonishment. Papal Rome is an enchantress. Old as she is like Ninon d'Anclos. The young fall in love with her. You will hear next from us at Naples. Affectionately yours, H.B.S. From Rome, the travelers went to Naples, and after visiting Pompeii and Herculaneum, made the ascent of Vesuvius, a graphic account of which is contained in a letter written at this time by Mrs. Stowe to her daughters in Paris. After describing the preparations and start, she says, "Gradually the ascent became steeper and steeper, till at length it was all our horses could do to pull us up. The treatment of horses in Naples is a thing that takes away much from the pleasure and comfort of such travelers as have the least feeling for animals. The people seem absolutely to have no consideration for them. You often see vehicles drawn by one horse carrying 14 or 15 great, stout men and women. This is the worst, as the streets are paved with flat stones, which are exceedingly slippery. On going uphill, the drivers invariably race their horses, urging them on with a constant storm of blows. As the ascent of the mountain became steeper, the horses panted and trembled in a way that made us feel that we could not sit in the carriage, yet the guide and driver never made the slightest motion to leave the box. At last 3 of us got out and walked, and invited our guide to do the same. Yet with all this relief, the last part of the ascent was terrible, and the rascally fellows actually forced the horses to it by beating them with long poles on the back of their legs. No Englishman or American would ever allow a horse to be treated so. The Hermitage is a small cabin where one can buy a little wine or any other refreshment one may need. There is a species of wine made of the grapes of Vesuvius, called Lachryma Christi, that has a great reputation. Here was a miscellaneous collection of beggars, ragged boys, men playing guitars, bawling donkey drivers, and people wanting to sell sticks or minerals, the former to assist in the ascent, and the latter as specimens of the place. In the midst of the commotion we were placed on our donkeys, and the serious, pensive brutes moved away. At last we reached the top of the mountain, and I gladly sprang on firm land. The whole top of the mountain was covered with wavering wreaths of smoke, from the shadows of which emerged 2 English gentlemen, who congratulated us on our safe arrival, and assured us that we were fortunate in our day, as the mountain was very active. We could hear a hollow, roaring sound, like the burning of a great furnace, but saw nothing. "Is this all?" I said. "Oh, no. Wait till the guide comes up with the rest of the party," and soon one after another came up, and we then followed the guide up a cloudy, rocky path, the noise of the fire constantly becoming nearer. Finally, we stood on the verge of a vast circular pit about 40 feet deep, the floor of which is of black, ropey waves of congealed lava. The sides are sulphur cliffs, stained in every brilliant shade, from lightest yellow to deepest orange and brown. In the midst of the lava floor rises a black cone, the chimney of the great furnace. This was burning and flaming like the furnace of a glass house, and every few moments throwing up showers of cinders and melted lava, which fell with a rattling sound on the black floor of the pit. One small bit of the lava came over and fell at our feet, and a gentleman lighted his cigar at it. All around where we stood, the smoke was issuing from every chance rent and fissure of the rock, and the Neapolitans who crowded around us were every moment soliciting us to let them cook us an egg in one of these rifts, and overcome by persuasion, I did so, and found it very nicely boiled, or rather steamed, though the shell tasted of Glauber's salt and sulphur. The whole place recalled to my mind so vividly Milton's description of the infernal regions that I could not but believe that he had drawn the imagery from this source. Milton, as we all know, was some time in Italy, and though I do not recollect any account of his visiting Vesuvius, I cannot think how he should have shaped his language so coincidentally to the phenomena if he had not. On the way down the mountain, our ladies astonished the natives by making an express stipulation that our donkeys were not to be beaten. Why, they could not conjecture. The idea of any feeling of compassion for an animal is so foreign to the Neapolitans' thoughts that they supposed it must be some want of courage on our part. When, once in a while, the old habit so prevailed that the boy felt he must strike the donkey, and when I forbade him, he would say, "Courage, signora, courage." Time would fail me to tell the whole of our adventures in southern Italy. We left it with regret, and I will tell you sometime by word of mouth what else we saw. We went by water from Naples to Leghorn, and were gloriously seasick, all of us. From Leghorn we went to Florence, where we abode 2 weeks nearly. 2 days ago we left Florence and started for Venice, stopping 1 day and 2 nights en route to Bologna. Here we saw the great university, now used as a library, the walls of which are literally covered with the emblazoned names and coats of arms of distinguished men who were educated there. Venice. A great trouble of traveling in Europe, or indeed of traveling anywhere, is that you can never catch romance. No sooner are you in a place than being there seems the most natural, matter-of-fact occurrence in the world. Nothing looks foreign or strange to you. You take your tea and your dinner, eat, drink, and sleep as aforetime, and scarcely realize where you are or what you are seeing. But Venice is an exception to this state of things. It is all romance, from beginning to end, and never ceases to seem strange and picturesque. It was a rainy evening when our cars rumbled over the long railroad bridge across the lagoon that leads to the station. Nothing but flat, dreary swamps, and then the wide expanse of sea on either side. The cars stopped, and the train, being a long one, left us a little out of the station. We got out in a driving rain, in company with flocks of Austrian soldiers with whom the third-class cars were filled. We went through a long passage and emerged into a room where all nations seemed commingling, Italians, Germans, French, Austrians, Orientals, all in wet-weather trim. Soon, however, the news was brought that our baggage was looked out and our gondolas ready. The first plunge under the low black hood of a gondola, especially of a rainy night, has something funereal in it. 4 of us sat cowering together and looked out of the rain-dropped little windows at the sides at the scene. Gondolas of all sizes were gliding up and down, with their sharp, fishy-looking prows of steel pushing their ways silently among each other, while gondoliers shouted and jabbered and made as much confusion in their way as terrestrial hackmen on dry land. Soon, however, trunks and carpet-bags being adjusted, we pushed off and went gliding away up the Grand Canal, with a motion so calm that we could scarce discern it, except by the moving of objects on shore. Venice, la belle, appeared to as much disadvantage as a beautiful woman bedraggled in a thunderstorm. Lake Como. We stayed in Venice 5 days, and during that time saw all the sights that it could enter the head of a valet de place to afflict us with. It is an affliction, however, for which there is no remedy, because you want to see the things, and would be very sorry if you went home without having done so. From Venice we went to Milan to see the cathedral and Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. The former is superb, and of the latter I am convinced, from the little that remains of it, that it was the greatest picture the world ever saw. We shall run back to Rome for Holy Week, and then to Paris. Rome. From Lake Como we came back here for Holy Week, and now it is over. What do you think of it? Certainly no thoughtful or sensitive person, no person impressible either through the senses or of religious feelings, can fail to feel it deeply. In the first place, the mere fact of the different nations of the earth moving, so many of them, with one accord, to so old and venerable a city, to celebrate the death and resurrection of Jesus, is something in itself affecting. Whatever dispute there may be about the other commemorative feasts of Christendom, the time of this epoch is fixed unerringly by the Jews' Passover. That great and solemn feast, therefore, stands as an historic monument to mark the date of the most important and thrilling events which this world ever witnessed. When one sees the city filling with strangers, pilgrims arriving on foot, the very shops decorating themselves in expectancy, every church arranging its services, the prices even of temporal matters raised by the crowd and its demands, he naturally thinks, wherefore, why is all this? And he must be very careless indeed if it does not bring to mind, in a more real way than before, that at this very time, so many years ago, Christ and his apostles were living actors in the scenes thus celebrated today. As the spring was now well advanced, it was deemed advisable to bring this pleasant journey to a close, and for Mrs. Stowe at least it was imperative that she return to America. End of Section 12. Old Scenes Revisited by Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Outdoor Life and Indian Stories by Edward Sylvester Ellis. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chad Horner from Ballyclare in County Antrim, Northern Ireland, situated in the northeast of the island of Ireland. Outdoor Life and Indian Stories by Edward Sylvester Ellis. Chapter 9. How to Find Your Way by the Stars. It is very important that those who frequent the forest should be sufficiently familiar with the stars to be able to tell their way by them. Often a compass is lost, or damaged, or there is not enough light to see the landmarks. At such a time a knowledge of how to find the pole star is invaluable, for, to the experienced woodsman, a glimpse of this star is equivalent to consulting a compass. It is really the most important of the stars we see, although not a very bright one, because it marks the north at all times and is fixed in its place, while all the other stars seem to swing around it once in every 24 hours, which makes it impractical to use them for guidance. The Dipper or Great Bear is well known to all American boys on account of the size, peculiar shape and brilliancy of this group, and the fact that it never sets in this latitude. This group always points to the pole star, or Polaris, which is about in a line with the stars, Alpha and Beta, which form the outside of the Dipper at the distance about 3½ times as great as the space separating these two stars. This star always points out the north. If the imaginary line between Alpha and Beta and Polaris is continued about the same distance beyond Polaris, it will meet Cassiopeia, 5 stars in the shape of a W, which, like the Great Bear, is always seen in our latitude. With these directions it should be always easy to locate Polaris. End of Chapter 9. How to Find Your Way by the Stars by Edward Sylvester Ellis. This recording is in the public domain.
Chapter 3 of Glimpses of Panama and of the Canal by Mary L. McCarty. Travel Collection 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anita Slama Martinez. Chapter 3 of Glimpses of Panama and of the Canal. When we went to breakfast on Monday morning at 8 o'clock, we found the first floor no longer the quiet and orderly place it had hitherto seemed. The alterations going on in the hotel embraced the ballroom and the dining room, both of which were being enlarged towards the front, and, of course, when we descended, the workmen were in full swing. We ate our morning meal to the sound of their hammers and saws, and gave thanks when we reflected that we should be far away at lunch-time, and that they would always be gone at dinner-time. Although we were to take only the afternoon trip over the Pacific Division, we were obliged to leave Panama at 10:20 in the forenoon in order to catch the sightseeing train at Culebra, where it would stop after its morning trip to allow the passengers to see the lock models and have luncheon. So it really was going to take about all day, and after breakfast we had only time to look over the papers, write some postcards, and chat a little in the lobby before starting to the station. On alighting from the train at Culebra, we found an ambulance drawn by mules ready to take us up to the administration building on top of the hill, and on reaching the entrance of the building, we were directed to the lecture room by an agreeable and courteous young gentleman who had come up the hill with us. Being interested in the subject of locks and desirous of understanding thoroughly the working of the canal, we found the lecture and the models extremely profitable, and went down the hill afterwards considerably enlightened, as we hoped also was the man who, on the way up, had remarked that he wouldn't know a lock if he met it in the road. What we went down the hill for was to get some lunch, and this we found at the Commission dining room, where for 50 cents apiece we were served with a very excellent meal, the quality being uniformly good, and the quantity about 3 times as much as we could eat. Nowhere else in the canal zone did we find so good a commission dining room as this one at Culebra. Thus fortified both mentally and physically, with lecture and luncheon, we blithely mounted the sightseeing car, an open car with seats running across, and with a floor which was high at the back and sloped down to the level of the lecturer in front, impatient to begin to see the big job. However, there is always some drawback, and now, although up to this point the day had been perfect, an uninvited little shower suddenly obtruded itself and even tried to get into the car, thus obliging the porter to lower the canvas curtains in order to keep us dry. Shutting out the rain meant shutting out the view, too, and this was afflicting, but it proved to be necessary for only occasional short periods, during which the lecturer told us about the things we were about to see and answered any questions we wanted to ask in a very pleasant and comprehensive manner. Presently we arrived at Pedro Miguel, in local parlance, Peter McGill, where we were switched to the construction tracks and taken out close to the lockwork. There we got out, and at last found ourselves face to face with one of the concrete monsters. Here words fail me. Stupendous seems to be the favorite adjective with most people, and I can't think of a betterer, but really a brand new one should be coined. Those locks look like the work of giants, and as if they would stand forever. Eternal as the hills, I said to myself, but just then a man of the party remarked, "Well, I suppose some thousands of years hence archaeologists will be digging around here, and will come across the remains of these locks and wonder what on earth they were anyhow." One pair of gates were done and closed, and as they are 7 feet thick and equipped with a handrail along the top for the use of the public, we walked across them, an umbrellaed procession, to the center wall, where we could see both sides and get a better idea of the 1,000 feet of length and the 220 feet of breadth of the double chamber. All the locks are double, in order that vessels can go in opposite directions at the same time. Also, if one is out of commission, the other can be used. Pedro Miguel lock is single in that it will raise and lower ships only one step of 30 feet. It is the link between the cut and Miraflores Lake, a small artificial body of water with an area of 2 square miles, formed by impounding the waters of 3 small rivers by means of the Miraflores Laxon Dam. As we stood on the walls, we thought of all that had been told us of their construction, and imagined the water rushing in for the first time through the huge tunnels, 18 feet in diameter, passing lengthwise of the loch through the center and side walls, then through lateral tunnels, which branch out from the first ones at right angles and run under the loch floors, then through openings in the loch floor into the loch chamber. And we pictured to ourselves a great ship coming in, attended by 4 electric locomotives operating on the walls, 2 in front towing, 1 at each side, and 2 behind, 1 at each side, to stop her when she gets into proper position. By the time we had gone over all this in our minds, we were summoned to climb back into the car and go on, across the bed of the future Miraflores Lake to the Miraflores Locks. These are 2 in flight, and will raise and lower vessels 55 feet in 2 steps between the lake and the sea level end of the canal, which connects with the Pacific Ocean 8 miles away. The work here was just the same as at Pedro Miguel, only there was twice as much of it, and we were still more deeply impressed with the immensity of the task which our country is accomplishing. From here we went on to Balboa, where the canal enters the ocean, and saw the great dredges at work in the channel and the long stone breakwater now under construction. The latter is 4 miles long, extending from the mainland to Naos, one of the group of 3 beautiful islands which the United States is fortifying to guard the entrance of the canal. These islands are exceedingly rocky and picturesque, their steep sides rising abruptly from the water to a great height, relieved here and there by trees and shrubs, whose varying greens contrast exquisitely with the dark rock. The 3 islets seem to have been dropped by nature exactly into the right position to fulfill their office of protecting the canal terminus. Drills and cranes and steam shovels and dirt trains and concrete mixers and track lifters had been thrown in to make good the measure of our afternoon's entertainment, and by this time we began to feel the need of a rest for our minds, so the return to Panama between 5 and 6 and the sight of the big Tivoli Hotel up on the hill were very agreeable. Resting and dressing and dining and gossiping with our fellow tourists formed a pleasant conclusion to the day, and at a much earlier hour than we were accustomed to keep at home we went to bed, feeling sure that the very excellent railroad at the foot of the hill would wake us up between 5 and 6 in the morning, and that the only way to get enough sleep was to begin early. Why that railroad did not have enough to do in transporting its crowded trains back and forth across the isthmus without turning missionary and trying to inculcate the early to bed and early to rise maxim into the passing traveler was more than we could understand. Such energy hardly accorded with the climate either, but then it was an American road, which fact was explanation enough, and for that reason we forgave it. We remembered the very last thing that we had not asked anybody about the West Coast boats. As there was no regular sightseeing trip the next day, we resolved to drive over to Balboa in the morning to the steamship office and make some inquiries of the agent. We were glad the regular trips did not come on consecutive days. It was so much pleasanter to have time in between in which to do things by ourselves and assimilate what had gone before. Therefore, we looked forward with satisfaction to the next 2 days. End of Chapter 3 of Glimpses of Panama and of the Canal.
View of the Capitol at Washington by Nathaniel Willis. Travel Collection. 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. View of the Capitol at Washington. There are many favorable points of view for this fine structure, standing as it does higher than the general level of the country. Besides those presented in the different drawings in this work, there are views from the distant eminences, which are particularly fine, in which the broad bosom of the Potomac forms the background. The effect of the building is also remarkably imposing when the snow is on the ground, and the whole structure, rising from a field of snow, with its dazzling whiteness, looks like some admirable creation of the frost. All architecture, however, is very much improved by the presence of a multitude of people, and the Capitol looks its best on the day of inauguration. The following description, written after viewing the ceremony of Mr. Van Buren's induction into office, will give an idea of the effect of this solemnity on the architecture. The sun shone out of heaven without a cloud on the inaugural morning. The air was cold, but clear and life-giving, and the broad avenues of Washington for once seemed not too large for the thronging population. The crowds who had been pouring in from every direction for several days before, ransacking the town for but a shelter from the night, were apparent on the spacious sidewalks, and the old campaigners of the winter seemed but a thin sprinkling among the thousands of new and strange faces. The sun shone alike on the friends and opponents of the new administration, and, as far as one might observe in a walk to the Capitol, all were made cheerful alike by its brightness. It was another augury, perhaps, and may foretell a more extended fusion under the light of the luminary new risen. In a whole day, passed in a crowd composed of all classes and parties, I heard no remark that the President would have been unwilling to hear. I was at the Capitol a half hour before the procession arrived, and had leisure to study a scene for which I was not at all prepared. The noble staircase of the east front of the building leaps over 3 arches, under one of which carriages pass to the basement door, and as you approach from the gate, the eye cuts the ascent at right angles, and the sky, broken by a small spire at a short distance, is visible beneath. Broad stairs occur at equal distances, with corresponding projections, and from the upper platform rise the outer columns of the portico, with ranges of columns 3 deep extending back to the pilasters. I had often admired this front, with its many graceful columns and its superb flight of stairs, as one of the finest things I had seen in the world. Like the effect of the assembled population of Rome, waiting to receive the blessing before the front of St. Peter's, however, the assembled crowd on the steps and at the base of the Capitol heightened inconceivably the grandeur of the design. They were piled up like the people on the temples of Babylon in one of Martin's sublime pictures, every projection covered, and an inexpressible soul and character given by their presence to the architecture. Boys climbed about the bases of the columns, single figures stood on the posts of the surrounding railings in the boldest relief against the sky, and the whole thing was exactly what Paul Veronese would have delighted to draw. I was in the crowd thronging the opposite side of the court, and lost sight of the principal actors in this imposing drama till they returned from the Senate chamber. A temporary platform had been laid and railed in on the broad stair which supports the portico, and for all preparation for one of the most important and most meaning and solemn ceremonies on earth, for the inauguration of a chief magistrate over a republic of 15 millions of free men. The whole addition to the open air and the presence of the people was a volume of Holy Writ. In comparing the impressive simplicity of this consummation of the wishes of a mighty people with the ceremonial and hollow show which embarrass a corresponding event in other lands, it was impossible not to feel that the moral sublime was here, that a transaction so important and of such extended and weighty import could borrow nothing from drapery or decoration, and that the simple presence of the sacred volume, consecrating the act, spoke more thrillingly to the heart than the trumpets of 1,000 heralds. The crowd of diplomatists and senators in the rear of the columns made way, and the ex-president and Mr. Van Buren advanced with uncovered heads. A murmur of feeling rose up from the moving mass below, and the infirm old man emerged from a sick chamber, which his physician had thought it impossible he should leave, bowed to the people, and still uncovered in the cold air, took his seat beneath the portico. Mr. Van Buren then advanced, and with a voice remarkably distinct
and with great dignity read his address to the people. When the address was closed, the Chief Justice advanced and administered the oath. As the book touched the lips of the new president, there arose a general shout, an expression of feeling common enough in other countries, but drawn with difficulty from an American assemblage. The sons and immediate friends of Mr. Van Buren then closed around him. The ex-president and others gave him the hand in congratulation, and the ceremony was over. End of View of the Capitol at Washington.